A whisper in the night. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every breath deliberate. Somewhere deep in a Russian forest, under a sky bruised with clouds, a faint hum broke the stillness. It was not the wind nor the rustle of leaves, but something mechanical, alive, and purposeful. A single drone, no larger than a child's toy, hovered low above the treetops, its red lights blinking like the eyes of a predator. Its shadow flickered over the frost-covered ground, darting toward a distant glow. A military airbase, its runways lined with the hulking silhouettes of bombers, sleeping giants unaware of the storm approaching. In a cramped, dimly lit room, thousands of kilometers away, a young Ukrainian drone operator named Oleksiy sat hunched over a screen, his fingers trembling on the controls. His eyes bloodshot from hours of focus, locked onto the grainy feed of the drone's camera. The airbase loomed closer now, its floodlights casting harsh beams across the tarmac. Oleksiy's heart pounded not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. This was no ordinary mission. This was Operation Spiderweb, a plan so audacious it felt like a dream or a nightmare. One wrong move, one flicker of detection, and the drone would be lost. The mission exposed and the hopes pinned on it shattered. The screen showed a Tu-95 bomber, its massive wings draped in darkness, tires stacked on its fuselage like a futile shield. Oleksiy's breath caught as he adjusted the drone's path, aiming for the fuel tank seam, a pinpoint target he'd memorized from grainy museum photos. His mind raced. This is for home, for the cities burning, for the voices I'll never hear again. The drone's hum grew louder in his ears, though he knew it was only the headset. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. Then a faint beep signaled the drone was in range. His thumb hovered over the button that would release the payload. One press and the night would erupt. Suddenly the feed flickered. A shadow moved on the screen, a Russian sentry flashlight in hand sweeping the tarmac. Oleksiy froze his pulse, a drumbeat in his throat. The drone was too close to retreat, its battery too low to hover indefinitely. He had seconds to decide, act now and risk detection, or wait and lose everything. His mind flashed to his sister's face, her smile before the war took her laughter. He whispered her name under his breath, a prayer, a promise. The drone's camera steadied, the sentry's light swung away, and Oleksiy's thumb pressed down. The screen flared white. A deafening roar filled his headset, though it was only a simulation of the explosion thousands of miles away. Oleksiy leaned back, his hands shaking as the feed cut to static. In that moment, he was no longer in a concrete bunker in Ukraine. He was in the sky, in the fire, in the heart of a mission that would echo across borders. The silence returned heavier now as the weight of what he'd done settled in. Had it worked? Had the web been spun? The story rewinds now to days before, when the seeds of this moment were planted in secrecy, courage, and a flicker of hope. Context: the stage of operation. Spiderweb. The world in June 2025 was a tapestry of tension woven with threads of hope, fear, and uncertainty. The Russia-Ukraine war, now in its third year, had settled into a rhythm of attrition, with neither side yielding ground easily. Front lines stretched across Ukraine's eastern plains, but the conflict had long since spilled beyond borders, carried by technology and ambition into the heart of distant lands. Operation Spiderweb, conceived in the shadowed halls of Ukraine's security service SBU, was a bold stroke in this evolving war, a plan to strike 5 Russian airbases: Irkutsk, Murmansk, Ivanovo, Ryazan, and Amur. These bases, scattered across Russia's vast interior, housed strategic bombers, Tu-95s, Tu-22M3s, and the rare A-50 reconnaissance planes, machines capable of shaping the war's trajectory from thousands of kilometers away. Irkutsk, nestled in Siberia's frozen heart, lay under a blanket of early summer frost, its runways flanked by dense pine forests. Murmansk, perched near the Arctic Circle, shivered beneath a sky that never fully darkened its airbase, a fortress of concrete and steel. Ivanovo and Ryazan, closer to Russia's core, sat amid rolling fields, their tarmacs bustling with maintenance crews. Amur in the Far East was a remote outpost where the steppe met the horizon, its isolation both a shield and a vulnerability. Each base was a world unto itself, guarded by radar sentries and the arrogance of distance, yet tethered to the war by the planes they sheltered. The weather on June 1, 2025 was a silent player in the mission. In Ukraine, a warm spring had given way to a humid summer with thunderstorms rolling across Kiev, where the SBU's planners worked in secrecy. In Russia, the airbases faced varied conditions: Irkutsk's crisp mornings, Murmansk's biting winds, and Amur's heavy fog that clung to the ground like a ghost. These elements shaped the mission's design. Drones needed to navigate turbulence, avoid detection, and strike with precision. The SBU had chosen FPV drones small and agile, capable of weaving through forests or skimming low over fields, their payloads modest but deadly when aimed at a bomber's fuel line or engine. The global stage added its own weight. Nations watched the war with bated breath, some offering aid, others enforcing sanctions, while diplomatic talks flickered and faded in neutral capitals. The airbases targeted were not just military assets, but symbols of reach and power, their destruction a message that distance was no sanctuary. Yet the mission's architects knew the cost failure could embolden their adversaries, while success might escalate tensions further. The SBU's planners, a mix of seasoned officers and young tech experts, worked in a Kyiv basement, their maps littered with red pins marking targets thousands of kilometers away. They spoke in hushed tones, aware that a single leak could unravel everything. For the drone operators, the context was simpler but no less heavy. They were young, most in their 20s, trained in haste but driven by purpose. They came from cities and villages, from Odessa's sunlit shores to Lviv's cobbled streets, each carrying a personal stake in the war. Their tools were screens, joysticks, and headsets, yet their battlefield was as real as any trench. The mission demanded precision, patience, and nerve, for each drone carried not just explosives, but the weight of a nation's defiance. As the clock ticked toward June 1st, they gathered in bunkers across Ukraine, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of monitors, their minds racing with the enormity of what lay ahead. Outside, the world turned, as it always had. Farmers in Ryazan tilled their fields, unaware of the drones that would soon pierce the night. In Murmansk, fishermen hauled nets under the midnight sun, their lives untouched by the war's distant pulse. In Ukraine, families huddled in shelters as air raid sirens wailed, their hopes pinned on unseen hands, guiding machines through the dark. The stage was set, the actors in place, and the curtain of night ready to rise. Characters, backstory, and inner world. In a concrete bunker beneath a nondescript building in Kiev, 3 figures sat in the dim glow of monitors, their faces etched with the strain of anticipation. They were the heart of Operation Spiderweb. Not generals or strategists, but ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary moment. Oleksiy, the drone operator whose trembling thumb had pressed the button in that critical instant, was the linchpin. Beside him were Irina, the mission's tech specialist, and Taras, the navigator who charted the drone's paths across Russia's vast expanse. Each carried a story, a reason for being there, and a quiet burden that bound them together. Oleksiy, 27. Hailed from Chernihiv, a city of ancient spires and resilient souls. Before the war, he was a mechanic, his hands more at home with wrenches than joysticks. His workshop had been a haven of grease and laughter, where he'd fix bicycles for neighborhood kids and dream of opening his own garage. The war changed everything. Chernihiv's streets, once alive with markets, were scarred by shelling, and his sister Olena was lost in an air raid that left only silence in its wake. Oleksiy joined the SBU not out of vengeance, but a need to protect what remained his parents, his home, the memory of Olena's smile. Each drone he guided carried her name in his heart, a whispered promise to keep fighting. Yet as he stared at the screens, doubt gnawed at him. Am I enough for this? What if I fail them all? Irina, 24, was the group's quiet genius, her fingers dancing across keyboards to calibrate the drone's systems. Born in Odessa, she'd grown up by the sea sketching ships and dreaming of studying engineering abroad. Her quick mind earned her a scholarship, but the war tethered her to Ukraine. She joined the SBU after seeing her university's lecture halls reduced to rubble, her dreams buried under ash. Irina's role in Spiderweb was to ensure the drone's signals evaded Russian jammers, a task that demanded precision under pressure. She hid her fear behind a sharp wit, but at night alone she wrote letters to her mother, unsent, confessing her terror of making a mistake that could cost lives. I'm not a soldier, she thought, but I'm all they have. Her pride in her work clashed with the weight of its consequences, a silent storm in her chest. Taras, 30, was the steady hand, a former geography teacher from Lviv, with a knack for maps and stars. His classroom had been a refuge for students filled with tales of distant lands and the promise of a wider world. When the war came, Taras volunteered, driven by a love for Ukraine's rolling hills and the stories they held. His wife Marta and their young son waited in a village near the Polish border, their letters his only tether to normalcy. Taras's job was to plot the drone's routes, weaving through forests and valleys to avoid detection. He saw the mission as a chess game, each move calculated, but his heart ached with every plan, knowing the cost of success or failure. I teach children to dream, he thought, but now I guide machines to destroy. The contradiction haunted him, yet he pressed on, driven by duty and the hope of a quiet life someday. Together they formed a fragile trinity, bound by shared purpose and unspoken fears. Oleksiy's hands shook with the weight of action, Irina's mind raced with the need for perfection, and Taras's heart carried the maps of a nation at war. They were not heroes in the cinematic sense, but people who rose each day to face the impossible. Their bunker was a microcosm of their world, cramped, cold, lit by flickering screens, yet warmed by fleeting moments of camaraderie, a shared joke, a sip of bitter coffee, a glance that said, "We're in this together." Outside, the war raged, but within these walls their hopes, doubts, and dreams collided, forging a resolve as delicate and unyielding as the drones they sent into the night. As June 1st approached, they sat together, maps and monitors, their battlefield, their thoughts, a mix of memories and prayers. Oleksiy saw his sister's face in every shadow. Irina clung to the rhythm of code, a lifeline against chaos. Taras traced routes with a teacher's precision, imagining his son's future. They were not just operators, but bearers of a nation's defiance, their inner worlds a tapestry of courage and fragility, ready to face the fire of the mission ahead. Movement. On the way to battle. The air in the Kyiv bunker was thick with the scent of stale coffee and ozone from humming electronics. It was May 31st, 25 hours before the launch of Operation Spiderweb, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The bunker, buried beneath layers of concrete and secrecy, was a cocoon of flickering screens and whispered plans. Oleksiy, Irina, and Taras moved through their tasks with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance, yet each step carried the weight of what was to come. The drones, 117 in total, were ready, small, sleek machines lined up in a hidden warehouse, their payloads carefully calibrated to strike with surgical accuracy. But the journey to this moment had been one of sleepless nights, meticulous planning, and the quiet hum of nerves stretched taut. The preparations began days earlier in a flurry of activity across Ukraine. In a nondescript facility near Zhytomyr, technicians loaded drones onto trucks under the cover of darkness, their headlights dimmed to avoid prying eyes. The vehicles rumbled through rural roads, past fields of sunflowers bowing under a late spring rain toward launch sites scattered across Ukraine's western and northern borders. Each drone was a marvel of ingenuity, built from scavenged parts and coded with Irina's algorithms to evade radar. Taras's maps guided their paths, weaving through Russia's forests, rivers, and steppes, exploiting gaps in surveillance. Oleksiy, trained to fly them, spent hours in simulators, his fingers memorizing the feel of controls, his mind tracing the outlines of distant airbases he'd never seen in person. Now in the bunker, the trio faced the final hours before launch. The room buzzed with low voices and the clatter of keyboards. Outside, Kyiv was restless, its skyline punctuated by the occasional wail of air raid sirens, a reminder of the war's ever-present shadow. Inside, time felt suspended, the clocks ticking a metronome to their racing hearts. Oleksiy checked his console, the screen displaying a live feed from a drone already airborne, its camera sweeping over Ukraine's darkened plains. The image was grainy, but he could make out the faint glow of villages, their lights like scattered stars. Home. He thought, his mind drifting to Chernihiv's quiet streets, now a memory scarred by war. Irina sat at her station, her eyes scanning lines of code, searching for flaws that could doom the mission. Her headset pressed against her ears, drowning out the bunker's hum with the rhythm of her own breathing. She paused to sip tea from a chipped mug, a gift from her mother, its warmth a fleeting comfort. If I miss one signal, one glitch. The thought lingered, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the numbers that danced across her screen. She glanced at Oleksiy, his face taut with focus, and felt a pang of pride. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, yet here they were carrying a nation's hope on their shoulders. Taras, ever the teacher, stood before a digital map projected on the wall, his finger tracing the drone's routes. Irkutsk's forests, Murmansk's icy cliffs, Amur's fog-shrouded plains. Each path was a gamble, a thread in the web they were weaving. He adjusted his glasses, a habit from his classroom days, and murmured coordinates to himself as if teaching the drones the way home. In his pocket he carried a letter from his son, a crayon drawing of a house under a bright sun. "For you, little one?" He thought, his resolve hardening against the doubt that whispered, "What if we don't come back from this?" As midnight approached, the bunker grew quieter, the team's movements more deliberate. The drones, now positioned at launch sites, waited like silent sentinels. Oleksiy slipped on his headset, the familiar weight grounding him. Irina ran a final diagnostic, her screen flashing green, a rare moment of relief. Taras double-checked the weather feeds, clear skies over Ivanovo, fog in Amur, a light wind in Murmansk. They exchanged glances, a wordless pact, forged in shared purpose. The air was heavy with unspoken fears, but also with moments of fleeting beauty. The soft glow of a monitor, the rhythm of a comrade's breathing, the distant sound of rain tapping the bunker's roof. The clock struck midnight, and the first drones lifted off their hum, a faint whisper in the night. Oleksiy's screen flickered to life, showing a patchwork of fields fading into darkness. Irina's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to counter any signal interference. Taras watched the map, his heart pounding as red dots began their journey across borders. The bunker felt smaller now, the world reduced to screens and signals, yet vast with the weight of what they carried. They were not just launching drones, but sending pieces of themselves, hope, fear, defiance, into the unknown, toward a night that would change everything. The battle begins, twist and struggle. The night of June 1st, 2025 unfolded like a held breath, the bunker in Kiev a pulse of quiet intensity. The screens before Oleksiy, Irina, and Taras glowed with the feeds of 117 drones each, a tiny speck of light carving paths through Russia's vast darkness. Operation Spiderweb was no longer a plan, but a living thing, its threads stretching across thousands of kilometers toward airbases in Irkutsk, Murmansk, Ivanovo, Ryazan, and Amur. The trio sat in their stations, surrounded by the hum of electronics and the weight of expectation, their faces illuminated by the cold blue of monitors. The mission had begun, and with it came a tide of adrenaline, doubt, and fragile hope. Oleksiy's screen showed the feed from his lead drone, codenamed Volya, Freedom, a name he'd chosen in a fleeting moment of defiance. The drone skimmed low over a Siberian forest near Irkutsk, its camera capturing the blur of pine branches under a moonless sky. The airbase was still 20 kilometers away, its floodlights a distant smudge on the horizon. Oleksiy's fingers gripped the joystick, his movements precise but tense, guiding Volya through a narrow valley to avoid radar. His headset crackled with faint static, a reminder of the distance between him and the machine he commanded. "Stay low, stay steady," he whispered to himself, his thoughts flickering to his sister's laughter, a memory that fueled his focus. Irina's station was a fortress of screens, each displaying signal strengths and encryption statuses. Her job was to keep the drones invisible, their transmissions masked from Russian jammers. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, adjusting frequencies as the drones crossed borders. A bead of sweat traced her temple, her mind racing to anticipate threats. One wrong code, one missed signal. The thought was a shadow, but she pushed it aside. Her eyes locked on a monitor showing a drone over Murmansk. The Arctic wind buffeted its frame, the feed trembling as it fought to stay on course. She murmured a command, rerouting its signal through a backup satellite, her hand steady despite the storm in her chest. Taras watched the digital map, a constellation of red dots moving in sync across Russia's expanse. His routes were meticulous, exploiting gaps in terrain and surveillance. But the reality of the mission tested his calm. A drone over Amur veered off course, caught in a fog bank that hadn't been forecasted. He leaned forward, recalculating its path in real time, his voice low but firm as he relayed coordinates to Oleksiy. "Adjust Svit 2 degrees west," he said, naming the drone after the dawn he longed to see with his son. The map was his battlefield, each dot a life entrusted to his care, and the weight of it pressed against his ribs. The first hour passed in a rhythm of focus and silence, broken only by clipped updates. Irkutsk drone at 10 kilometers, Oleksiy reported, his voice steady but tight. Murmansk signal holding Irina confirmed, her fingers never pausing. Ryazan approached clear, Taras added, his eyes scanning for threats. The bunker felt like a ship adrift, its crew bound by a shared pulse. Outside, Kiev slept under a humid summer sky, unaware of the threads being woven far beyond its borders. The drones moved like ghosts, their hum lost in the night, each carrying a payload that could shift the war's fragile balance. Then came the twist. A red alert flashed on Irina's screen. A drone over Ivanovo had been pinged by a Russian radar. The signal was faint, a brush rather than a lock, but it was enough to spike her pulse. "We've got a problem," she said, her voice cutting through the bunker's hum. Oleksiy's head snapped toward her, his drone feed still steady, but his heart lurching. Taras leaned over his map, showing the drone Nadia Hope, now dangerously exposed. "It's too close to abort," Taras said, his teacher's calm fraying. The radar sweep could escalate, triggering defenses that would unravel the mission. Irina's hands danced over her keyboard, rerouting Nadia's signal through a decoy frequency, a desperate gamble to make it vanish. Oleksiy adjusted Nadia's path, diving it into a shallow ravine, the feed shaking as branches scraped its frame. "Come on, hold together," he muttered, his thumb hovering over the controls. The drone's battery was at 40%, too low to evade for long. Irina's screen showed the radar signal weakening, then spiking again. "They're scanning harder," she said, her voice tight. Taras traced an alternative route, his mind racing through topographic maps. "Take it through the riverbed low now," he urged. The team moved as one, their actions a symphony of instinct and trust, each second a battle against detection. Minutes stretched into eternity, the bunker's air thick with tension. Then Irina exhaled sharply. "Signal's clear." Nadia's back in the dark. Oleksiy knotted his grip, easing on the joystick, but the strain lingered in his eyes. The drone was safe, but the mission was far from over. The airbases loomed closer now, their runways lined with bombers unaware of the shadows approaching. The trio exchanged a glance, a wordless acknowledgement of the hurdle crossed and the ones still ahead. The night was young, and the web was only beginning to tighten. The sacrifice. Decision and turning point. The bunker in Kyiv was a crucible of tension, its air thick with the hum of machines and the unspoken weight of the moment. It was past 2 a.m. on June 1, 2025, and Operation Spiderweb teetered on a knife's edge. The drones scattered across Russia's vast expanse were closing in on their targets' airbases in Irkutsk, Murmansk, Ivanovo, Ryazan, and Amur. Oleksiy, Irina, and Taras sat at their stations, their faces etched with focus and fatigue, the glow of screens casting shadows that danced like ghosts. The mission had survived its first scare, but the night was far from forgiving, and a new challenge loomed, one that would demand a choice none of them had prepared for. Oleksiy's eyes were locked on his screen where Volya, his lead drone, hovered 500 meters from Irkutsk's airbase. The feed showed a Tu-95 bomber, its silhouette stark against the flood-lit tarmac, a sleeping giant, unaware of the threat gliding closer. His fingers trembled on the joystick, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. This is it, he thought, picturing the fuel tank seam he'd memorized, a target no larger than a dinner plate. His headset crackled faintly, the drone's hum a distant echo, but his mind was elsewhere, back in Chernihiv, where his sister's voice once filled the air. He steadied his breath, ready to release the payload. Irina's monitors flickered with data, her algorithms holding the drone's signals steady against Russian defenses. But a new alert flashed. A drone over Murmansk, Zirka Star, had lost its primary signal, caught in a sudden burst of jamming. Her heart sank, her fingers racing to reroute the connection. "Zirka's blind," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. The drone was seconds from its target, a Tu-22 M3 parked near a hangar, but without a signal. It was a ghost, drifting without guidance. She glanced at Oleksiy, whose focus remained on Irkutsk, and at Taras, whose map showed Zirka's dot, faltering. "We can't lose it," she whispered, her mind racing for a fix. Taras leaned over his map, his glasses reflecting the red dot of Zirka as it veered dangerously close to a radar tower. His routes had been flawless until now, but Murmansk's Arctic winds and electronic countermeasures were unraveling his plans. He traced an alternative path, but the drone's battery was critically low, 10% and dropping. "We need to act now," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "If we don't, it's gone." His thoughts flickered to his son's crayon drawing a house under a bright sun, and the promise he'd made to return. But the mission came first, a truth that tightened his jaw. The turning point came with brutal clarity. Irina's screen showed a narrow window. They could sacrifice Zirka by sending it into a decoy maneuver, drawing the radar's attention to protect the other drones, particularly Volya in Irkutsk, which was moments from striking. But doing so would mean losing Zirka's target, a critical bomber, and potentially exposing the mission's pattern. The alternative was to push Zirka forward, hoping its signal held long enough to hit the target, but risking detection of the entire swarm. The decision rested with the trio, a choice between one strike and the mission's survival. Oleksiy's hand hovered over his controls, Volya's feed steady but demanding his focus. "If we lose Zirka, we lose Murmansk," he said, his voice low, the weight of failure heavy in his words. Irina's eyes met his, her fingers pausing on the keyboard. "But if we don't act, we lose everything," she countered, her voice trembling with the stakes. Taras, ever the anchor, spoke softly. "Zirka can draw them off. It gives Volya and the others a chance." His words were calm, but his eyes betrayed the cost, a piece of their plan, their hope sacrificed for the greater good. The bunker fell silent, the hum of machines deafening in its own way. Oleksiy knotted his throat tight. "Do it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Irina's fingers flew across her keyboard, sending Zirka into a high-visibility climb, its signal blazing like a flare. Taras adjusted the paths of the remaining drones, redirecting them to exploit the distraction. On Oleksiy's screen, Volya's feed cleared the Tu-95, now unguarded. He pressed the button, and the screen flared white, a silent explosion blooming thousands of kilometers away. Volya had struck its payload, igniting the bomber's fuel line, a spark that would ripple through the night. But Zirka was lost. Irina's monitor showed its signal vanish, the drone likely downed by a Russian countermeasure. The trio sat in stunned silence, the cost of their choice sinking in. Oleksiy's hands shook, his mind replaying the flare of Volya's success against Zirka's sacrifice. Irina stared at her screen, her breath shallow, the weight of her code's failure heavy on her shoulders. Taras folded his hands, his map now missing one red dot, a void where hope had been. Yet the mission continued, the remaining drones pressing forward, their web tightening around the airbases. The night was not over, and their resolve, though bruised, held firm. Aftermath. The cost and silence. The bunker in Kyiv was cloaked in a stillness that felt heavier than the night itself. It was nearing dawn on June 1, 2025, and Operation Spiderweb had burned its mark across the Russian interior. The screens before Oleksiy, Irina, and Taras flickered with the last feeds from their drones, some now dark, others showing distant plumes of smoke rising into a graying sky. The mission had struck its targets, airbases in Irkutsk, Ivanovo, Ryazan. and Amur bore the scars of precise explosions, their runways littered with the husks of bombers reduced to smoldering shells. Murmansk, however, remained untouched, a wound left by the sacrifice of Zirka. The trio sat in their chairs, the weight of success and loss settling like ash. Oleksiy leaned back, his headset dangling around his neck, the silence louder than any explosion. His screen, now static, had captured the flare of Volya's strike, a Tu-95 consumed by fire, its wings crumpling like paper in a storm. Reports trickling in confirmed the damage. Dozens of strategic bombers crippled, their threat dimmed for now. But the victory felt hollow. Zirka's loss gnawed at him, a reminder of the gamble they'd taken. He rubbed his eyes, the burn of fatigue mingling with memories of Chernihiv's ruins. Did I do enough? He wondered, his sister's face a faint shadow in his mind. The bunker's cold walls offered no answer, only the echo of his own breathing. Irina stared at her monitors, their green lights now dimmed the code that had guided the drones, lifeless. The loss of Zirka was a bruise on her heart, a failure she couldn't shake. She'd rerouted signals, outwitted jammers, and kept the swarm alive, but one drone's fall felt like her own. Her hands, still poised over the keyboard, trembled slightly, the chipped mug of tea beside her long gone cold. She thought of Odessa's waves, the freedom she'd once sketched in her notebooks, now buried under the weight of war. I did my best, she told herself, but the words felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. She glanced at Oleksiy and Taras, their silence a shared language of exhaustion and resolve. Taras folded his map, its digital glow fading as he powered down the display. The red dots that had marked their drones were fewer now, some lost to defenses, others to the limits of their batteries. He traced a finger over Murmansk's coordinates, the untouched airbase, a quiet rebuke. Yet the other strikes had shifted the war's unseen currents. Bases, thousands of kilometers from the front lines, now smoldered, their power curtailed. Taras thought of his sons drawing the bright sun he'd promised to see again. The mission's success was a step toward that promise, but the cost was a shadow he couldn't outrun. We gave them a chance, he thought, but at what price? The bunker's air was heavy with the scent of sweat and metal, the hum of machines replaced by a quiet that felt like the world holding its breath. Outside, Kiev stirred under a dawn streaked with clouds, its people unaware of the threads spun in the night. The airbases far across borders were waking to chaos, smoke curling over twisted metal, the earth scarred by fire. No bodies littered the runways, no blood stained the ground, but the absence of life was its own kind of loss. The bombers, once symbols of reach, were now silent, their wings clipped by unseen hands. The trio sat in the stillness, their bond forged in the crucible of the mission. Oleksiy reached for a water bottle, his hand brushing Irina's mug, a small gesture that grounded them. Irina managed a faint smile, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of pride. Taras pulled his son's drawing from his pocket, its colors a stark contrast to the bunker's gray. They didn't speak of victory or defeat, only of what they'd done together. The war would go on its rhythm unbroken, but for a moment, the airbase's silence was theirs, a fragile pause before the world turned again. Reports would later quantify the damage. Dozens of bombers disabled, a blow to the war's machinery. But in the bunker, the cost was not in numbers, but in the weight of choices made in the drones, lost in the sleepless nights that would follow. The sky outside lightened its gray, giving way to gold, a reminder of time's relentless march. Oleksiy, Irina, and Taras rose, their movements slow, their hearts heavy with the quiet pride of having dared the impossible. The mission was over, but its echoes would linger, a web woven in fire and shadow. Reflection, message to viewer. The dawn light crept through a narrow window in the Kiev bunker, casting a faint glow across the concrete floor. It was June 1st, 2025, and Operation Spiderweb had left its mark, a delicate web of fire and resolve, woven across distant air bases. Oleksiy, Irina, and Taras stood together, their screens dark, their bodies heavy with the weight of the night. The mission was over, its echoes still reverberating in the silence of their thoughts. The world outside stirred unaware of the threads they had spun, but within these walls the trio carried the quiet truth of what they had done. A truth not of triumph or loss, but of humanity, tested by war. Oleksiy sat on the edge of his chair. His hands folded the headset now resting on the console. His eyes traced the bunker's cracks, each one a map of his own doubts and hopes. He thought of Chernihiv, of his sister's laughter that no longer filled its streets, and of the drones he'd guided, each one a whispered promise to protect what remained. The success of Volya's strike lingered in his mind, a flare of light against the darkness, but so did Zerka's fall, a sacrifice that saved the mission but left a hollow ache. What does it mean to fight? He wondered. To carry a nation's heart in your hands, knowing they'll never see your face. He pulled a small photo from his pocket, his family smiling in a world before the war, and held it tightly as if it could anchor him to that fleeting peace. Irina leaned against her station, her fingers tracing the chipped mug that had been her companion through the night. The code she'd written had held guiding most of the drones to their targets, but Zerka's loss was a weight she couldn't shake. She thought of Odessa's waves, their rhythm a dream she'd once chased, now distant under the war's shadow. Yet in the bunker's quiet, she felt a flicker of pride, not for the fire they'd sparked, but for the trust she'd shared with Oleksiy and Taras. They were not soldiers in the way stories told, but their hands had shaped a moment that would ripple beyond their sight. We did what we could. She thought, her gaze softening. Maybe that's enough. Taras stood by the window, the dawn's light catching the lines of his face. He held his son's drawing, its crayon sun a beacon in the gray. The map he'd crafted had guided the drones through forests and fog. A teacher's lesson turned into a web of defiance. Murmansk's untouched airbase lingered in his mind, a reminder of limits. But the strikes at Irkutsk, Ivanovo, Ryazan, and Amur were threads of hope for a future where his son could grow without fear. War takes, but it also reveals, he thought, who we are when the world is watching or when it's not. He folded the drawing carefully, tucking it back into his pocket, a promise to keep moving forward. The bunker was silent now, its machines at rest, but the air held the weight of their shared journey. They had faced the impossible, woven a web across borders, and carried the hopes of a nation through a single night. The war would continue its rhythm unbroken, but this moment was theirs, a pause where courage, sacrifice, and quiet pride intertwined. They exchanged a glance, no words needed, their bond forged in the crucible of choices made under pressure. The dawn outside painted the sky in hues of gold and gray, a canvas of endings and beginnings. What does it mean to be human in a time of war? To guide a machine through the dark, knowing its fire will change lives unseen. Oleksiy, Irina, and Taras carried no answers. Only the weight of their actions and the hope that their efforts might one day bring a quieter world. Their story is not one of heroes or victories, but of people who rose to meet the moment, their hearts beating in rhythm with a nation's resilience. What would you do faced with such a choice? How would you carry the weight of a single night that echoes beyond the horizon? This story was inspired by real events and people. Some details have been fictionalized for emotional narrative purposes. Join us at Ukraine Frontline War Stories to hear more untold tales of courage and humanity from the Russia-Ukraine war. Subscribe to our channel, share your thoughts in the comments. What does bravery mean to you in the face of conflict? Let these stories linger and let them remind us of the fragile, enduring strength of the human spirit.